Good evening, and welcome to tonight's conversation with the Reverend James Lawson. Reverend Lawson joins us tonight from his home in Los Angeles to share words and wisdom about the past, the present, and the future. Tonight we gather to learn and to organize in order that white supremacist violence will not clog our airways, stifle justice, or dictate who faithful people will be. We are here tonight to sit at the feet of wisdom, to be nourished and challenged, so that we may continue to dismantle the wrongs that Reverend Lawson has dedicated his life to fighting: racism, sexism, violence, and plantation capitalism. We are grateful for your presence and are better because you have chosen to be a part of tonight's conversation. Many of you joined us back on January 14th when we experienced some technical difficulties, so welcome back. And a special thank you to Reverend Joe Daniels and Reverend Lafayette for their extraordinary storytelling and their ability to improvise on the fly. As we begin tonight's conversation, let us connect with God's Spirit. Please pray with me. Holy God, we are a bit stumped about how to move forward as a nation. Even the words we use to describe our pain cause division. Even the stories we tell find their roots in different soils. And yet you were the sprout that came from the stump of Jesse. You were the new life that came from the tomb. So perhaps our dead ends are not overwhelming for you. We are yours in all of our mess and muck. And that means we are not beyond redeeming or rebuking, or restoring or recalibrating. So this evening we say thank you for your claiming and challenging love. May we use that love to resist evil, to work for justice, to stand up for the least, not just with our words, but also with our lives. Amen.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Theo Brown. I have the privilege of being the director of the McClendon Scholar Program at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, which is, for those of you not from our area, in downtown Washington, D.C. The purpose of our programs that we sponsor throughout the year is to feature scholars, authors, theologians, activists, and other thought leaders who can help us deepen our faith so we can be more effective in our work in the world. During the past few years, we've had many notables join us for our programs. I mentioned some before. It's worth noting the range of people that we have. Not long ago, we had a senator, although then it was Reverend Raphael Warnock, join us. We've had Dr. Walter Brueggemann, Sister Simone Campbell, James Foreman Jr., Karina Gore. Just 2 months ago, we had E.J. Dion. We've had many who have blessed us with their presence. And if you're interested, a complete list of our scholars and the links to presentations from most of them can be found on our website, which is nyapc.org/McClendon-SIR. I think that's being put in the chat right now. And you can just go to the New York Avenue website and find it that way. Tonight, of course, we have a very special guest, and we're going to introduce him to you in a moment. As Heather mentioned, many of you were with us last month when we scheduled this program. Originally had to be rescheduled. So glad you're back with us. Others perhaps were not with us then and are now. We're, as Heather also said, very thankful for Bernard Lafayette and Taylor Branch, who pitched in at our last program and delivered a wonderful panel discussion. And they're with us again this evening, as well as, of course, Reverend Lawson. We're thankful to them and to everyone who's with us this evening for the program. as we think about who's with us this evening, one of the interesting things is always to get a sense of where you all are from. One of the nice things about webinars, frustrating as they are in some ways, in that you can't see each other, you can't hear each other, we can't applaud, we can't sing, but there are advantages to it. And one of them is that we, of course, can have people tune in from all over the country, even around the world. The other advantage, of course, with webinars is that it is snowing outside now in the Washington, D.C. area. Those of us who live here know that only a few flakes can lead to a postponement of an event. And we don't have to worry about that. We're all warm in our apartments and our homes, and Reverend Lawson is in Los Angeles and others joining us. So we're able to proceed in spite of the weather. I do want to point out the chat function down at the bottom. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with webinars by now, but there is a chat function, and we're going to open it up right now. And some of you are already signing in and saying where you're from. It's always interesting to see people comment on where they're signing in from. So if you would tell us what city and state you're in, and if you're with a particular church or congregation or organization, you might mention that. But you can see already someone from Sarasota, Florida, and Indianapolis, New Jersey, someone from DC, or as Chocolate City, as they say, New York, Seattle, Washington, someone from Texas. You can see the list there in chat. It's wonderful. So we're really a community of people coming together, most of us in the DC area, but people really from around the country. Thanks to those of you who used the chat just now, and we're going to have you use it again at the end of the program. During most of the program, we're going to have it turned off as a general function. If you have something, a comment you want to make, you can make it in chat, but it'll be sent to the panelists. It'll go to the technical staff, not to a general sharing, because we want to focus on the presentation tonight. We'll open the chat again near the end and invite you to type in some comments from the evening or any message perhaps that you want to send to Reverend Lawson at that time. We're also going to use the Q&A function, and it is open, but we do ask you save it for questions. If you have a question you would like Reverend Lawson to answer, please type that in, and you'll note there is a function where you can like a question. So if you look at the questions being posed a little later in the evening and you see some you like, it's similar to what you were going to ask, just kind of click the like function, and that allows us to see, which questions are most interesting. And while we will try to get to several questions, we may not have as much time for that as we sometimes do in our programs. And so it helps if you use the like function. We get a sense of which of these are things you particularly want to hear about. All right, so I want to give a quick overview of the webinar, and then we'll hear from Reverend Lawson and begin the discussion with him after his remarks. In just a moment, Reverend Joe Daniels, pastor of Emory United Methodist Church on Georgia Avenue in the Brightwood neighborhood of DC, is going to introduce Reverend Lawson. Emory, if you're not familiar with it, is a wonderful congregation, very involved in the community in many creative and important ways. And it's been a privilege for me to get to know that congregation and many of the individuals in it during the past few years. Reverend Daniels knows Reverend Lawson through some family and Methodist connections in Los Angeles. And it was his connection with Reverend Lawson that really made this program possible. Reverend Lawson will then give his presentation. We look forward to hearing whatever he wants to share with us. After his talk, Reverend Daniels will then engage Reverend Lawson in a conversation, ask him some questions, discuss with him. And during that discussion, he also will bring in Bernard Lafayette, who many of us heard from if we were in our program last month. As many of you know, Bernard was in the first group of students trained by Reverend Lawson in Nashville back in 1959 and 60. And he then became a very important leader in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and was a vital part of the brave and incredibly important work that SNCC did across the South in the 1960s. After that discussion, we then will have some time for a few questions from the ones you send in. And then after the question period, we'll have a few moments of some final comments, some brief words of thanks to Reverend Lawson, and then we'll invite him to make a brief closing remark if he wants, and Reverend Heather Shortledge of New York Avenue Presbyterian will offer a benediction. So I hope you'll stay all the way to the end. We will invite you then to make some comments of appreciation, both for what you hear tonight and in general, anything you want to say to Reverend Lawson and the other panelists. And of course, there are many things can be said about Reverend Lawson. One thing is clear to say at the start, he really is a genuine American hero. And we are deeply grateful for his life and work and honored to have him with us tonight as a McClendon scholar. So I now want to introduce Reverend Joe Daniels, who will introduce Reverend Lawson to us.
Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to be with you on this evening, this icy evening, this snowy evening in DC, this warm evening in Southern California, warm afternoon, I should say. It is just a joy and privilege to be with everyone once again for this fabulous, fabulous occasion. I could go on and on about our guest presenter tonight, and I'm not going to, because he really can introduce himself. But he was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, just a little bit outside of my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was raised in Massillon, Ohio, not too far away from Uniontown. As was mentioned, he's a Methodist minister. I'm very proud of that as a United Methodist minister with him. He's a third generation Methodist minister. He is widely considered as the architect of nonviolence within the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. summoned him from the north, from Ohio down to the south, to teach nonviolent protest techniques amongst civil rights leaders many, many years ago. And he came, he listened, and he came and he taught many. He taught many who would lead the sit-ins and the freedom rides and other protests that uniquely changed this country for the better. He is an icon. He is a legend. He is history in and of himself. He would end up training the future leaders of the civil rights movement, people like Diane Nash and people like James Bevel and Bernard Lafayette, who's with us tonight. People like DC's own Mayor Marion Barry, who many of us in this area know very, very, very well, and the legendary Congressman John Lewis. On a personal note, as I introduce him tonight, on a personal note, I'm very humbled because our guest presenter has been pastor to many of my family members in California. He was pastor to many of them at the Holman United Methodist Church in Los Angeles for many, many, many years. Even his brother Phil, my uncle Al, was his brother Phil's lay leader at Easter Hill United Methodist Church in Richmond, California, Northern California. And my dear Uncle Cornish, who has gone on to be with the Lord. He and Dr. Lawson were very, very close friends and colleagues. And so Dr. Lawson is a family, dear family friend, dear family. He's family, and we thank God for him, and I thank God for him. And it's just a joy to be with him tonight and to dialogue with him. Everyone, I want to introduce you to none other than the Reverend Dr. James Lawson. Can we welcome him in a great way?
Thank you, Joe Daniels. You're right. We have over the years known ourselves as family in both intimate and extended ways. And that's been one of the great privileges of my life, I should say to you, Joe, and one that I will always relish. It's been a source of great strength and encouragement. I am very pleased to have been invited to be the McClendon Scholar for 2021, or for at least for this month. And I am cognizant of the fact that I follow a fine parade of excellent friends and colleagues. Our last effort in January, has already been pointed out, had technical problems, whatever these were. But this evening, we're all here. We're going to move forward with this event in ways which I hope will be extremely helpful to all of us. You can't see this tie hat I have on, but I want you to notice it. This tie was worn often. It was one of the favorite ties of C.T. Vivian. So I'm wearing it tonight. His family sent it to me as a visible token of his continuing presence in my life and in my work. So I just want to point that out. I wear it on a regular basis now in a lot of the Zooms that I have been doing. I hope I come through loud and clear. I am fastening my remarks this evening around two scriptures. The 18th verse of the 29th chapter of the book of Proverbs, and the 5th verse of that same chapter. The 18th verse being familiar from the old King James translation, where there is no vision, the people perish. And the 5th verse, with which many people are less familiar, goes thusly: by justice. Imagine, from the book of Proverbs. By justice, the king establishes stability. By justice, the government constructs access and stability and truth. So I lift that up first. Where there is no vision, the people perish. While the more recent translations change it, I reach back to the King James, and I reach back to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who in his lifetime used the translation I'm using. Well, I use the translation he used. Where there is no vision, the people perish. And sometimes in thinking about this and using this, I want to add a couple of other verses to that text. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Where vision flourishes, the people prosper. Where vision flourishes, the people prosper. And the first point I want to make under this rubric is this. For whatever reason, history, or the God of history, gave we, the people of the USA, visions. A historical document called the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, that all are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Represents a monumental miraculous vision in the midst of a world that was largely under the domination of tyrannies. And that this group of early settlers in the 13 colonies had the temerity to create a vision. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And then to create a second document, we, the people of the United States of America, in order to perform a more perfect union. Here we have vision. Here we have vision. We have visions. These two historical documents have more than sufficient numbers of visions that are visions that heal people, that can give people a sense of community, that allows people to have a sense of direction, not to be pulled all across asunder by various forces. There are visions here that could have directed us through slavery. So, where there is no vision, the people perish, but the origins of our country were, in fact, to establish vision and visions by which we should be inspired and led in the development of this nation. It would be my contention tonight that we have been largely prevented from enriching and enacting and imposing those visions that would come from our two historical documents. Present and current conversation around the trial in the impeachment trial in Congress, or around the new administration that is in place, or around tensions that divide us, which are obvious. The chief tension is the tension of history and the tension of a promising future against the reality of our not wanting to use the visions we have. We've been prevented from doing so by 4 historical forces. And it's inadequate, the public conversation at this moment, totally inadequate for the people of the United States of America. These 4 historical forces have persistently interfered with we hold these truths. And they are currently more important to too many USA people, more important than we hold these truths are self-evident. These 4 forces, which I insist upon and teach out of my learnings of the 50s and 60s and 70s, are these. 1, the sexism, male chauvinism, and male domination, which is a worldwide disease. Sexism racism, violence, and plantation capitalism. And these four negative streams, what the United Methodist Church might call spiritual forces of wickedness, out of our baptismal vows, spiritual forces of wickedness, sexism, racism, violence, plantation capitalism. One can talk about all four of these in many ways, but I want simply to connect the fact that they are connected to each other. There can be no eradication of racism if we do not eradicate sexism. The whole nation has the difficulty of sexism that interferes with, we hold these truths to be self-evident. There can be no eradication of the violence because violence permeates the violence of language. All four of these elements have the notion that there are various people out of God's creation who are not worthy of creation, are inferior, therefore can be discounted and uncounted in any measure of community. All four of these negative spiritual forces of wickedness are permeated by violence, the violence of language, the violence of structures that perpetrate wickedness. I'm not going to try to pretend to yank the levels or the measures of violence between the four of them, but it should be said that plantation capitalism is the most violent of the four. We do not have free enterprise. We do not have free market. We do not have entrepreneurship because we are an economy that worships wealth and the fame and the power and the political domination that comes from the wealth. And we are more of a plantation capitalist society today than we were in 1787 or 1789. These forces of spiritual wickedness have influenced more people in the United States for the present moment, more than what we know. In the present moment in our political situation is more connected to these forces than it is connected to a vision of the equality of all humankind and the rights that are given to us by the Creator. On the media, I hear people constantly talking about the freedom my country gave me. The freedom has given me. The freedom does not come from the United States of America. According to the Declaration of Independence, liberty is a gift of creation. My freedom has not come from the wars that the United States has fought, almost endless wars. The Jimmy Carter Center recently announced that from 1789 to the present moment, our country has only not been at war something like 22 years. 1789 to 2021, we have been at war constantly, with the exception of about 22 years. That is, of course, ingrained in plantation capitalism. Because war is a fierce instrument of corralling wealth and creating domination. And the big issue for me is not, Donald J. Trump. Donald J. Trump is but an icon that represents sexism, racism, violence, and plantation capitalism. I'm more concerned about Donald Trump II, Donald Trump III, because it looks to me in Congress as though we've created more Donald Trumps in Congress than we have created William Penns or Thomas Jefferson's. And I could go on about this in great length, but I want to suggest a couple of other things before I finish my opening statement. I would lift before the religious forces of the United States, not as such the civil rights movement, which is a term that, to the best of my knowledge, comes out of the Congress of the 1860s, who wrote the first Civil Rights Act of 1866, which for me means that civil rights is an omnibus term. Civil rights movement is a big term under which there are many, many dimensions, and those dimensions are a story in of themselves. I give it an illustration of this, the Little Rock Nine. You rarely hear the story of the Little Rock Nine told as a dimension of the civil rights movement, because there's a drama of 9 high school people of great courage. I met all of them in January of 1958. It's one of my first responsibilities as the Southern Secretary of Fellowship of Reconciliation, working intimately with Martin King in the emerging nonviolent movement of America, which is the term that Congressman John Lewis uses for what we did. Little Rock Nine, magnificent story. It's a story in and of itself. 9 students who want a better educational opportunity, who have careers in their mind that require, for an example, a good biology lab, which Dunbar High, the black high school, did not have. So people who wanted to go into medicine and science couldn't practice it in high school. They did not have adequate textbooks, and they did not have adequate laboratories of any kinds, which is why 85 students from Dunbar High School, a black school, volunteered to go to Central High, which had first-class science laboratories and had a high reputation for the quality of education that the school taught. That's a great story. It's far more about these 9 youngsters about their capacity of character to endure the hostile, active Governor Faubus trying to drive them out, the Ku Klux Klan trying to drive them out, the White Citizens Council trying to drive them out, the parents from Central High School, many of them trying to drive them out, and students themselves trying to drive them away from the school. Wonderful story. A piece of history that every high school student in the country ought to read. The agenda of Black folk was radically added to with the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. That produced Rosa Parks, Martin King, and Mary Jo Robinson, and a variety of wonderful people, and became the major pillar for direct action, nonviolent direct action. That was followed by a Tallahassee bus boycott, by students boycotting Coca-Cola in Claflin College in South Carolina, a whole variety of activities that went on. But the second major campaign was the sit-in campaign, led by our people in Nashville, which produced major leaders, as already been pointed out, for the struggle. Well, that nonviolent campaign of the United States of America is the term that Congressman John Lewis put on it, which helped me to do my thinking about what we happened, because from 1953 to 1973, we had major direct action campaigns. Contradiction to the terrible, violent USA cultural assault upon the Capitol, we organized ourselves to walk in the face of racism and violence and segregation and say, it must end. This boycott, this mass meeting, this strike, this march, this economic boycott are all dramatic manifestations of our determination that the United States will end its experiment with becoming a racist nation, especially in the light of the Declaration of Independence, and especially in the light of we, the people of the United States of America, in order to perform a more perfect union. I want to lay out 1953 to 1973 as a model, because that movement can also be called the Black Church movement, as some historians have called it, as Vincent Harding, the late historian, has called it. It can also be called the Black Freedom movement. I personally prefer John's term, the Nonviolent Movement of America. I also call it personally, for historical reasons, the Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King movement. I offer it to you as an illustration of engaging Jesus's primary teaching of the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. I offer it deliberately as a major example of what it means to be the people of God who are committed to trying to understand and to execute God's purposes on the earth as the galaxies portray the order of God in the heavens. I lay it before you. If you want to talk about what the mission and work of the church and the synagogue and of religion ought to be in the United States, there it is. 1953 to 1973, led by an ardent member of the AME, St. Paul AME Church in Montgomery, Rosa Parks, and by Martin King Jr., the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, also in Montgomery. I say to you, if you really want a message for America, that's the message. And you want to really know what we ought to be doing in the 21st century, that's the message. You can update it and create it and do it better, but that fundamentally is the issue. And I would say to you, that's already begun in the 21st century because the Black Lives Matter movement performed in more than 2,400 locations of our society, performed in more than 8,000 demonstrations, performed in 2,400 locations, involving 15 to 25 million people, and reported by many scholars, but also affirmed by my own effort to study it, especially in the first months on television, and study the reports I could find. Largely 97% nonviolent. This is what the scholars of movements are saying in the United States, especially at Erica Chenoweth from Harvard University, the Kennedy School. The largest nonviolent campaign ever in the history of the country. And you should know something. I feel very good about it because for years I've been teaching, for decades I've been teaching, that what the United States needs more than anything else is, in the 21st century, nonviolent campaigns that makes what we did in the 20th century look pale in comparison. It is only that which will cleanse our country of sexism, racism, violence, and plantation capitalism. It is only that which will dismantle the wrong, which has to be dismantled because the right has no space to emerge. The right, the true, the beautiful has a little space to emerge up against our systems of wrong. So my word to the United States and to the churches and religions in this new year is framed in what I have now tried to say. And I will conclude by raising the question that Martin Luther King Jr. raised in his final book, which was sort of summary question to the United States. Where do we go from here? Chaos or community? January represents the depth of the chaos that is happening and can happen and will happen unless we can have all sorts of voices and power centers and structures in all kinds of places emerge that will insist we hold these truths, and we, the people of the USA, of America. Chaos or community? I contend that in the production in a miraculous fashion in 1765, 68, 1716, 1770 of this great vision, all are created with certain unalienable rights by the Creator. and the Constitution of 1789. And in those documents, God was offering our country and our peoples, all of them, the way towards the only future that is possible. And how I wish I could hear and see more of the business leadership of this nation. They're the ones who want to dominate the water of the earth and make money from it. Oh, how I wish I could see the Chamber of Commerce demanding that we have a society of economic justice and equality. Boy, how I wish we could hear voices that resonate out of Congress and out of the White House across our 50 states, saying to them, saying to all of us, we hold these truths, therefore. But we of the churches, we of religion, have no choice, chaos or community. And my own life has been an effort to walk the way of community. And I've only tried primarily to follow Jesus in my own fashion. And as I finish, that will be my continuing mantra, my continuing work. Thank you.
Doc, this has been tremendous. This has been tremendous. There's so much to ask you, and I want to get in as much as we can. Let me just say, first of all, thank you for laying out this brilliant presentation. This has been tremendous. I want to first pick up where you left off with Martin Luther King Jr. talking about where do we go from here, chaos or community. I want you to go back if you can and then come forward. Where would you, if you are the James Lawson of 1953, but now you are in 2021, where would you tell us that our efforts to build community need to start? Where would you begin your work?
Well, I happen to think that if the United States is to find community and justice, two institutions must be persistently organized. I think this cannot happen if, number one, religious organizations, local churches, local synagogues, are not a place where the vision and where the work is done. That's one of the reasons I remained as a pastor for some 40-some years, and that was my calling and what I stuck to. And then the second institution which I work in still is the organization of labor unions. And people don't know the work I've done for the last, since 1980s in Los Angeles, where California, Los Angeles, has become more and more a country, a county, a city, a state influenced by working families who are organized in hundreds of unions. I have been a part of that since the mid-'80s. In LA, we have seen labor unions grow to over 800,000 people in some over 200 local unions, all united together around our labor council, our labor center, and using great amounts of nonviolence to shape unions, great amounts of the philosophy. the beloved community is one of the things that I've been teaching. So I continue that work.
So you would direct the young activists then to the church and to the labor unions.
Well, absolutely. I would direct also progressive people and the academy. If you want the two institutions that can bring about this country's finest vision, then the local church, the local religious bodies, and there's some wonderful examples all across the country, wonderful examples that come out of 1953 to 1973, and the wonderful examples continuing. So if they want to have the movement to move forward, that's one of the institutions that can be most powerful. And then labor unions is the second institution.
So in that, how does the church?
That's where I'm working the most.
Got you. Got you.
I am teaching still at Northridge. I teach courses on nonviolent struggle, theory and practice, and I teach the movement of nonviolence in the United States. Been many good campaigns, and then I work also in consultation with a variety of union organizations.
So you would inspire the young activists to start there. If you had to define succinctly for the young activists the term plantation capitalism, how would you define that? How do you define that in a succinct?
The notion, well, our United States is the best example of it. The wealthiest man in the country is Jeff Bezos of Amazon. In less than a generation, he's emerged at 100 or so billions of dollars. The Walmart family the Walton family in less than 30 years became the richest family in the United States. That's plantation capitalism. You cannot do that except in an economy where you can steal and cheat. And we know that the emergence of that kind of an economy in the United States has meant that the wages of U.S. working families have been decreased. The new day is that we do not have employees in a company. We have associates and independent contractors who live in poverty, which increases the dividends off of Wall Street and the stock market, and which allows the Walton family and the Bezos family to emerge. That's plantation capitalism.
Yeah. That's good, Doc. That's good. The 20-year period you talk about, you mentioned that some would call it the Black church movement. And you and I have talked a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement and how that movement has really excited you in the midst of it all. Some would argue very effectively that there has been a disconnect between the Black church and the Black Lives Matter movement. How do you see there being a connection in a way that can begin to start a new movement in many respects, a new movement over these 20 years, or a new 20-year movement as you laid out?
Well, there's less of a disconnect that is known. In places like Los Angeles, the Black Lives Network meets in Black churches. It has a committee of Black pastors who are part of the Black Lives Matter. I assume that other places, the same kind of network is emerging. After all, the Black church is the freest institution that Black folk have.
Yes, it is.
And community organizations that are going to do good work have to have a place where they can meet. And invariably, the social justice issues have to come out of Black churches.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if there's that big disconnect. I have not really studied Black Lives Matter from that perspective, but I imagine And some of the people I know locally, where I know Black Lives Matter better than elsewhere in the country, locally, these are extraordinarily good people. And the clergy people among the finest in the country.
I would agree. I would agree. I would agree. Where do you put voting rights in this? Where do you, particularly in light of what we saw in Georgia, with the work of Stacey Abrams and the election of John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock?
Well, I put it where
the
Black movement has put it. Remember, registering to vote was one of the earliest strategies that the NAACP proposed as it grew out of the Niagara movement. And for almost 100 years, well, no, this is 2021. No, for more than 100 years, the NAACP has been pushing vote, register, get in the political process. So it's the oldest strategy we Black people have had, apart from the establishment of ourselves and communities and whatnot, and extinguishing slavery and every vestige of racism. So, but it gets more emphasis than the harder work, because the harder work is the desegregation of the hearts and minds of the nation and the discovery of liberty on the part of people who've been victims of racism and sexism. The discovery of humanity, So it gets pushed aside by the political process, which tends to think that's the most important piece. I happen to think, from the perspective of Black people and the Black movement, the most important piece, now that we have a Democratic Party White House and Democratic Party controlled Congress, how are you going to show the nation the vision the nation needs to dismantle and to allow the vision to come forward? What are you going to do in the midst of a pandemic? How are you going to help the people of America see that we're not doomed to despair in the pandemic? Physically or spiritually and morally? This is the big question that now is the important question.
And so the prophet tells us, write the vision and make it plain. The vision that you challenge our leaders today begins with what specifically?
Well, I personally think, like our movement, Martin Luther King was our wonderful leader and advocate. The first vision in my mind that ought to be lifted up is we hold these truths to be self-evident. We often used it in the 50s and the 60s. It's embedded in Martin King's Washington March speech of 1963. It's embedded in our philosophy. So I happen to think that that's the most powerful vision and should be used because it is teachable.
I want to bring one of the persons who you trained so powerfully and so wonderfully well in the movement, Bernard Lafayette, into this conversation, if I can. Would love for Dr. Lafayette to join us at this time, if he would come on. The question that I would love to have the two of you all discuss, if we're able to get Dr. Lafayette in, is around in you all's interaction and in your classroom over the period where Dr. Lawson, you were training Dr. Lafayette. You all obviously had much that you were facing. Obviously, Blacks could not use basic facilities. There was segregation. There was discrimination, obviously, around employment, all of that. If you were teaching Dr. Lafayette today, Dr. Lawson, what would you teach him primarily in this day and age? And Dr. Lafayette, what would you want to learn from Dr. Lawson to help you in this day and age?
Well, I want to make a one quick response.
Okay.
I did not try to train anybody. I was using the tools of education as the major form of preparation. In my mind, the term training might be used. Bernard, I'll say it this way to you. On February the 27th in Nashville, when we knew we were going to be arrested, and we had the big gathering at First Baptist preparing to go downtown, we try to train people how to behave as they went in that demonstration, which would cause many to be arrested. But the preparation that went on week after week in our workshops is what laid the foundation for the training. So I separate preparation and boot camp from when you're going on a demonstration and how you instruct and encourage people to follow the discipline. So what I did that Saturday morning at the behest of the Central Committee and ran that stage of the game, the staging area all day, that was training. But it was undergirded by the fact that we had continuous workshops in which people learned far more than handling one demonstration.
Dr. Lafayette, how would you respond and join in on that?
Well, I would say that the most important thing that we got from Lawson was how to prepare ourselves for the confrontations that we would likely receive. In fact, the first time we went to sit in was not a protest. It was a test. And we didn't plan to get arrested. We just went and sat in to see what would happen. But we tried to avoid arrest. So when the policeman came, we got up and left and came back. And it was Jim Lawson that took us through, and he calls it the boot camp. And that was the
Bernard, you were the first one to use the term boot camp about the workshops in Nashville. I mean, as far as I remember, you are the first one to use the boot camp.
Yeah.
Metaphor.
And that was to prepare us. And I didn't really appreciate the whole thing in terms of understanding it until I got into graduate school. And what he was doing was preparing our emotions by taking us through this role play. And we call it social drama. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that was to make sure that when we were confronted, we didn't lose it, so to speak. But sometimes you already feel that you know what to do and you're prepared to do it, and you think you're going to carry it out, but then your emotions, you lose it. And under certain circumstances, people have good intentions, but they can't keep themselves together. So what Lawson did for us was to keep us, okay, prepared both emotionally as well as physically. And so therefore, we did not lose it. And I think that that's the thing that we're talking about. And the other thing, in terms of leadership, now the thing that I remember is that Jim Lawson didn't tell us who to select, who to do this, or who to. He simply gave us the foundation, and he gave us the criteria for leadership, and we selected the people who were um, going to take different roles. And that's the other thing that we learned is that you have different roles to play. Like Diane Nash, she was selected as a spokesperson, and it was basically because she had a way with the media. She was an English major, and she was very articulate. And what Jim Lawson taught us is that we've got to make sure that in our publicity or our media approach, that we keep our philosophy and our goals in place. So we were interested in how you win people over, okay? Not how you just sort of confront people and call them names and all that. No, we didn't do all that. We always appealed to the conscience of people. And in our statements, we always had statements that we had with us. We passed out to people who were observing us so they would understand our purpose and not let somebody else tell what we were doing and why we were doing it. So that was very key. So he taught us in various ways to do that. And I want to say this because I don't know how much time we got here. There is no coincidence, as we mentioned earlier about Marion Barry becoming the first black mayor of Washington, D.C. There's no coincidence, okay, that we continue the freedom rides. And many of us continued in the movement. It never stopped, okay, in the beginning. John Lewis becoming, what, um, the chairman of SNCC, all right? In fact, we had two chairmen of SNCC out of Nashville alone, Marion Barry and John Lewis, okay? That was no coincidence. But it was the leadership training that made all the difference in the world, all right? And so Lawson was able to bring the best out of us. That was the key thing, bringing the best out of us rather than the worst. And it was no miracle that this other students from all of the colleges and universities had confidence in us and followed our direction. So what he was basically doing is training leadership. And that's the key thing that must happen in every movement that's going to be successful. You've got to be able to train leadership. And one of the things that was happening was that we had leaders, student leaders from various universities and colleges, including Meharry Medical School, okay, including students from Vanderbilt. We had students from Scarrett, different colleges, black and white, okay, and of course from the seminary, American Baptist College. So what he was able to do is to build a coalition of leaders. They were head of fraternities and sororities, head of the student bodies, like, Bevel was the past president. John Lewis was the student body president of our school. I was the editor of the yearbook. So that was my kind of leadership, justification. But the point I'm making is that that coalition of leaders, he taught us how to get along with each other and how to make decisions. Sometimes we stay up late at night because we made decisions based on consensus, not the majority.
So this is good, and this is great. I want to bring Theo Brown in because I want to ask Theo to bring to us some questions and answers that are coming from our audience tonight. And so, Theo, as you're coming on, I want to ask Dr. Lawson. You targeted lunch counters, and you targeted lunch counters for particular reasons that were obviously fitting into the context of that day and time. I'm a part of a group in DC, the Washington Interfaith Network. We've been targeting corporations in order to bring racial equity. Is that where you would start today? Would you start someplace else in terms of nonviolent resistance and seeking, as Dr. Lafayette has said, to win people over, but to bring about change? Where would you start, Doc?
Are you talking about me?
Dr. Lawson.
Lawson, yeah.
Well, I think I've already said the local congregation, in my mind, and working families getting organized into strong unions and visionary unions. That's where I work. So that's what I want to continue doing.
Let me pick up on a couple of questions that have been asked. Reverend Daniels has already asked some of the questions that were submitted in the question period. And there's a couple of questions about concern about leadership in the movement and whether there's much exciting in the movements that are happening, social justice movements. Concern expressed by some in the question that people are not as committed to nonviolence. They're not getting maybe the training, Bernard, that you talk about. What advice would you all have or ideas about how we can reaffirm the importance of nonviolence in social justice movements? Reverend Lawson, and then maybe Bernard Lafayette, if you want to comment after that. How do we emphasize nonviolence and address the concern about so many social change movements seem to me not as interested in that?
Well, I think that the best way to do this is not necessarily in the process of education alone. Remember, the work in Nashville was a deliberate work. We had a project in mind. We had agreed, our planning was based upon our agreement that we were going to start a campaign in Nashville to desegregate downtown Nashville. So our work was not theoretical. It was aimed at accomplishing a task.
Mm-hmm.
We had chosen by June of 1959, we had chosen the desegregation of downtown Nashville. It's the media that shorthanded the notion that it's a sit-in movement. Our goal was begin the public desegregation of downtown. That means the white colored signs would come down. Mm-hmm. The double restrooms would be renovated. Means there'd be no more water signs over water fountains saying white water only, colored water only. So our workshops and the presentation of nonviolence and the preparation had a task in mind. So I happen to think that the best way to do nonviolence is to do it with a task in place.
Good. Bernard, anything you want to add to that?
Not do it theoretically.
Yes. One thing that some people are not aware of, even historians, is that we desegregated the Greyhound bus station lunch counters downtown when we desegregated the dime stores.
Yeah.
So in Nashville, we had,
Exactly.
they decided, as Jim was saying, and that was an exact model, an example of what he just said. Because what sense would it make for them to desegregate the lunch counters at the bus station and have segregated restrooms or segregated water fountains, okay, or segregated waiting rooms? So the entire bus station desegregated,
Mhm.
okay?
Same time. Yeah. In fact, they did it a little bit earlier, I think, Bernard.
Yeah.
Yeah, they did it when we when we were sitting in downtown at the lunch counter. Yeah. I was one of those who participated in because the manager, and this sounds kind of odd, but it's true. We got word that the manager at the Greyhound bus station was serving uh, college students or young people who were black, okay, in an integrated way, depending on where. But when older black people would approach the bus station, they would send them around the back, through the alley, in the kitchen, to eat on a porcelain table, okay? We heard about that, and I immediately went down and talked to the manager, and he denied that he was doing that. It so happened that we was in the lunch counter area, and I said, "Don't tell me that you're not doing that." I said, "You see that white fellow sitting over there? He was one of the students from, you know, Peabody or someplace who was with us." I said, "He told me everything you did," and he was so chagrined. So we went back and we had to sit in all night. He locked the doors, turned out the lights, put tape on the refrigerator as if we are gonna, cook something. And it was like 5:30 the next morning that I went and asked to be allowed to go into the waiting room because I needed to make a phone call to get some transportation so we can get back to our dormitories and get ready for class
Mm,
because we made our point.
right.
So the short of it is that once he realized that we were not going to stop our actions until he included all the black people,
Good.
all right? And some cab drivers got mad and they saw me making a phone call in the phone booth and they came and kicked the door in and put a hammer on my headlock, and pulled me out and started beating me. And every time they knocked me down, I got back up because I was trained by Jim Lawson how you respond to people who are violent. And I stood up and looked at them in the eye. And I tried to show as much love and concern. They said, "Well, let's catch him," but I wasn't running. So the point is, we confronted that situation in a way that we continue to use our nonviolence training until that bus station was completely desegregated.
Well, let
And
me ask.
so,
Thank you. Yeah.
uh, so when Jim Lawson talked about all of downtown, it was understood. Now, one thing that happened during the fall was the movie theaters. In 11 nights of demonstrations, we desegregated 5 movie theaters downtown Nashville.
Wow. Let me ask another question that several people have asked, and it speaks to the difficulty of resisting violence and confronting violence in our society. And several people have liked a question about balancing self-care and self-preservation with being an activist and fighting against the four evils that you mentioned, Reverend Lawson. Wonder if you'd each just talk about that a little bit, Reverend Lawson, and maybe a brief comment from you, Bernard, about recommendation on self-care and preservation for people who are in this struggle in the long run?
Well, I think self-care issue is a more contemporary issue of the last generation or so. In the movements of the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s in the 20th century, we tended more to think in terms of ourselves as disciplined people who took care of ourselves so that we could engage in the struggle. Because I concretely taught all the time that you couldn't be engaged in some of the things that we did without even developing a strong body, without exercising and walking and playing sports.
Yeah.
Because you had to have a tough body, could endure. So, but our emphasis was much more on that we had to be willing to give up the self in the cause of truth and justice, far more than about self-care. Self-care is, of course, a discipline. It's one of my disciplines all the time. But that can't become primary.
Yeah, good.
Primary has to become the fact that out here in our country, millions of babies and young people and old folk are suffering, and that our nation has got to change to go after dealing with human need.
Good. Thank you.
We were unprepared for the pandemic because we have not made a healthcare system accessible to every baby born, an essential part of our understanding. And here the religious bodies have been even more unfaithful with a Bible that puts great emphasis upon God wanting you well. Yeah. God is the physician. You can be healed. The religious community has been abjectly immoral in not seeing to it. And we have
that people are whole.
System
that people are whole.
That embraces every one of our 330 million people.
Yeah, thank you. Bernard, do you have a comment about discipline or taking care of oneself in terms of the struggle? Any advice you'd offer to activists and how they balance being able to be healthy and care enough for themselves and do the work?
Yes, I think you should try to stay healthy and strong so you can be able to make an important contribution. But I'd like to pick up on something that Jim said earlier about the people of wealth and how that is, I think we have to help young people, particularly, understand the difference in terms of wealth. What is wealth? It's not the brake truck that's going to be coming behind your hearse when you're on the way to the cemetery. So your worth, okay, is worth less, all right, ultimately. But your real worth and your real value is how valuable are you to others. That will determine your wealth and your worth, whether you are worthwhile. And it's what you give that makes you have the wealth and the value that you need. So we have confronted many different situations. And as I mentioned over there earlier, the picture behind you of Medgar Evers. And I was telling them earlier, Jim, that was the same night that I was killed, that he was killed, that I was attacked. And Ben Elton Cox supposed to have been killed. It was a tri-state conspiracy. The FBI told me that. Okay, they planned to kill me in Selma. And they did attack me. But when they did, I called for help. All right, so you got to be concerned about your health and your wealth. So I called my neighbor who was upstairs over me, and we called him Red because he was light skinned. And Red had been in the military, Vietnam and Korea, and he came across the banister with a rifle. And I put my hands up and I said, "No, Red, don't shoot." So I was protecting the guy who had the gun on me. Now, it's not impossible, but it's not probable that someone's going to shoot their own shield. So by trying to save his life, the guy who was supposed to kill me, that was his assignment. FBI told me.
Thank
Okay.
you. Yeah, great story. Thank you. There are a number of other questions. I wish we had more time for the discussion. We need to honor our time limit here and close in a few minutes. I want to just make a kind of quick announcement here too, and then we'll have some closing comments, some words of thanks to Reverend Lawson, and also then we'll invite you, Reverend Lawson, just to say a final 1 minute or two at the end here, if you would like to, what you'd like us to take with us. I want to remind you that this is the website I mentioned earlier that has videos and recordings of our various programs. And there will be a recording of this program available up on that website within the next couple of days. So if you want to review this or you want to share it with others who are not able to see it, you can certainly do that. There also is information there about our future programs. There are two I want to mention. March 20th, Dr. Judy Fentress Williams, a talented speaker and preacher from Virginia Theological Seminary, will make a presentation. And then earlier, Rabbi Heschel was mentioned, and there's a new film on his life. We'll be showing that film as part of a webinar and having a discussion. So we'll be sending information about that, but want to make you aware of these. We want to take just a couple of minutes as we close to hear a few people. We've heard Bernard Lafayette talk a little bit about his appreciation for what he learned from the trainings earlier and his experience. And we have a couple of other people here to make some comments, just briefly, of appreciation of Reverend Lawson's work and what his comments tonight. And the first is Joe Daniels. No, not that Joe Daniels. We've been hearing from Joe Daniels, but Joe Daniels III, who also knows Reverend Lawson some from his work with him and has been inspired by that and work he's doing in the community now. And he joins us from Fayetteville, Arkansas. And in just a moment, I'll invite him to make a couple of minutes of comments. And then Bernard, if you have another brief comment you want to make after that, we have time just for any kind of summary comments you want to make. And then finally, we have with us Taylor Branch, who many of you know, of course, is an award-winning author and historian of the civil rights movement. And Taylor is going to close with some comments for us about Reverend Lawson and what he's heard tonight, and comments on his role in the civil rights movement. So first, Joe Daniels III, and then Bernard, a brief comment from you again, if you would, you want to say, and then Taylor Branch. And then after that, Reverend Shortledge will offer a closing benediction. So Joe, welcome, glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Mr. Theo. Dr. Lawson, just to do this one more time, especially during Black History Month, is amazing. I remember just coming up and hearing your name around the house, and then being able to see you on multiple occasions. And I don't know if you remember this, but this was a highlight of my education so far, as I've been learning. When you gave me this book, I have pieced through this book as best as possible. And so I gave my comments that you heard the last time we did this. And so I didn't want to say the same thing twice. But I've been doing devotion. Our church out here in Northwest Arkansas has been looking at Romans 12. And if I could say that your life has been a great model of Romans 12, even from a young childhood, changing the way you think, not being able to use your fist to solve every problem, but having your mom change the way you think, and then tapping into your God-given gifts, and being able to leave a legacy of utilizing your gift to not only have an impact on the church bodies that you pastor, on the students that you teach, but in the leadership that you've done through nonviolence, and using that as a tactic to get this country to live up to what it claims on paper it needs to live up to. So thank you for being a model. Thank you for allowing your life to outlive you, and what we will be able to do as young people to make this world and make this country live up to what it needs to be. The key word I have moving forward is, how do we find ways to allow people to see liberation? And I think that's the task for us moving forward. So thank you. And I can't wait to hop on the phone call with you again to be able to continue the dialogue and continue moving forward. Thank you. Theo, back to you.
Bernard, do you have a brief comment you want to share, a final comment? You need to unmute yourself, Bernard. I think, here we go.
Is that it?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. Very quickly, one of the things we want to do is be able to teach our young people how the government works, because they're part of that and they're affected by that, the government. So what I like to see happen is, since we don't teach it in schools anymore, civics, I like to see us organize. Okay, the church can do this. Organize what we call a youth legislature. In other words, replicate from age 12 to 17, have them go and run for office, okay? And also have them have a monthly meeting where they bring in the elected officials from the adult legislature and learn about any kind of, the bills that they get ready to pass in the state legislature, and have the youth legislature vote on it first. Okay, and they'll learn who is representing them and what the duties and responsibilities and the limitations, and that way they will then be able to function effectively, and more of them will be able to participate, because they're turning 18 every day. So when they meet once a month, you can just simply, have a party. Yeah, a youth party. All right.
Good, thank you. Yeah, we have right near at time. We're just going to go a few more minutes here. We won't run long, but we do want to hear from Taylor Branch, and then a final word from Reverend Lawson.
Well, thank you. I have been studying Bernard and Jim Lawson's movement for most of my life now, and have been enthralled to do so. He told me, Jim told me years ago that he went all the way to India to get greater depth in Gandhi's nonviolent movement, only to find out that a nonviolent direct action movement had broken out in Montgomery, and that he came back and met Dr. King in a cafeteria and was invited down because Dr. King recognized how big nonviolence was and how important it was and how rare the leadership was. And for me, the enduring lesson since then about Jim Lawson is that he understands, like nobody else, how big and how profound nonviolence is, not only to our faith, to the ministry of Jesus, but to our nation. If you believe in votes, you believe in nonviolence. We're now in a huge drama about breaking out violence that should teach us how precious nonviolence is and how profound it is. And that's the thing that I think was Jim's lasting contribution. Most people tend to dismiss nonviolence as something associated with weakness, in a military worshiping society and are blind to how profound and central nonviolence is to the promise of America. That's why it's so unique that Jim is talking about we the people and the Declaration of Independence, because it was so rare in that time for people to try to organize a system around votes rather than violence. And that to me is the uniqueness of his ministry and the richness of it intellectually. That to me, Jim Lawson is both a prophet and a patriot of nonviolence in the highest sense of freedom. And that's why he deserves lasting tribute and appreciation from everybody in America and around the world.
Thank you so much, Taylor. We're going to invite you, Reverend Lawson, just to give a final, whatever word you want to leave us with. But as we do, I want to turn on the chat function again, and the general chat will be open. And I want to invite each of you who are with us to answer this question. What do you want to tell Reverend Lawson about how his life's work and or his message tonight is helpful to you? And we invite you to share a very specific thought about that. Just be helpful to get that feedback, and we'd like to share it with him later, the comments you make. So take some time now as he makes his final comment, and then we have the benediction, and we'll leave the chat on for a few minutes for whatever you want to type in your response to his message and work. So Reverend Lawson, again, thank you so much for being with us today. You've given us so much to think about. And I just want to invite you, if you have a final word or two you want to say to us here as we close.
Well, I appreciate it being here this evening with all of you. Appreciate Bernard Lafayette, Joe Daniels, and appreciate you, Taylor Branch, your long history of reporting and studying these matters and your remarks this evening. Gandhi called nonviolence the greatest force of the universe. Both Gandhi and Martin King recognized that in our very dangerous world, dangerous because of the massive presence of the power of the human beings to commit suicide, and an economic order and a military order that thinks that violence is a viable option. King and Gandhi both insisted that nonviolence is a call to Western civilization especially, but the entire human family, that we must change the paradigm by which we live today, that wealth and power and technology and artificial intelligence are the way of the future. That will inevitably lead to the suicide of the race. Nonviolence is the creative energy of the universe that created the universe and that created the human race and spread us across the earth. And it is the power we must learn if indeed we appreciate the gift of life and want to exalt that gift in every way we can. So I appreciate very much being here this evening in this webinar and seeing all your faces, renewing contacts with people of my past who nevertheless remain people in the faith community with which I am surrounded and in which I hold membership. Thank you for a great evening.
Heather, if you have a word of benediction for us, thank you so much again, Reverend Lawson and everyone.
Friends near and far, as you leave this place, have courage. Hold fast to what is good. Return no one evil for evil. And yet name what is wrong. Be willing to get into some holy trouble. Do not tolerate or downplay or tiptoe around the systemic roots of racism that undergird us, our institutions, and this un-United States of America. Find your voice and use it. Do the work that is uniquely yours to do. Be disciplined. Take care of yourselves, especially your body. Together, we do have the power, the incredible, tremendous power of non-violent resistance to build a new world. Go in peace. Amen.